You can leave a conversation convinced you made your own decision. Nobody threatened you, nobody raised their voice. Nothing about the exchange looked openly controlling. Then, 10 minutes later, you catch yourself wondering why you agreed to something you never wanted in the first place. That is what makes subtle influence difficult to recognize. Pressure does not always arrive looking like pressure. By the time you notice the frame around the decision, you may already be standing inside it. The more unsettling possibility is that the decision may have started earlier, while you were still relaxed enough to believe nothing important was happening. One tactic further down this list is especially difficult to detect because it can leave you feeling completely free while the outcomes that mattered were narrowed before you even started choosing. The disturbing part is not that somebody forces you, it is that you can walk away defending a choice whose boundaries you never set. We will come back to that one. First, start where control often begins, with what you are allowed to see. Niccolo Machiavelli drafted The Prince around the end of 1513. It was published in 1532 after his death. The book became closely associated with power, political survival, and an uncomfortable observation about human behavior. People do not always act openly, fairly, or for the reasons they publicly claim. That does not mean Machiavelli left behind a handbook of 10 conversational tricks. He did not. What he offered was a way of examining power without automatically accepting appearances. That raises an uncomfortable question about ordinary relationships. How many interactions look harmless simply because the person with more influence has no reason to make that influence obvious? You have probably seen some version of it. At work, one person somehow knows what management is thinking before everyone else. In a friendship, you raise a legitimate complaint and somehow walk away apologizing. Inside a group, nobody receives a direct order, yet decisions repeatedly end up favoring the same person. Any one of those outcomes can happen innocently. When the pattern keeps repeating, however, another explanation becomes possible. The most influential person in the room may not be the one making the strongest argument. It may be the person quietly shaping what everyone else is reacting to. Sometimes it happens much closer to home. You are known as dependable, calm, easy to work with. Someone asks for something you would rather not do. You hesitate, and the atmosphere changes. Their messages become shorter, their warmth fades, or they simply stop responding. At that point, you are no longer evaluating the request itself. You're trying to escape the feeling created around your refusal. The other person may not consciously think, "I am going to pressure them now." That does not make the pattern irrelevant. If they have learned that distance makes you reconsider, the behavior can repeat because it produces a result. That may be one of the hardest forms of leverage to recognize. A pattern does not need to be carefully planned from the beginning to become useful to the person benefiting from it. People who get pulled into these situations are not necessarily weak. More often, emotional pressure reaches them before they identify where it came from. The point of understanding these tactics is not to distrust every compliment, pause, deadline, or disagreement. It is to notice when an interaction begins changing what you feel, before you have decided what you think. By the end, these 10 patterns should look less like 10 unrelated tricks, and more like variations of a few basic forms of leverage. The first begins before anyone pressures you directly. It begins with information. Every decision starts with a picture of reality. You decide who deserves trust based on what you know about them. You judge whether a situation is dangerous from the details available to you. You decide whether someone acted unfairly from the version of events you received. Now consider what happens when another person builds that picture first. They do not necessarily need to lie. That is the part people often miss. A distorted story can be assembled almost entirely from true pieces. Someone tells you what happened during a meeting, but leaves out the sentence that would change the meaning of the argument. Another person warns you about someone before the two of you ever meet. So, ordinary behavior now passes through a filter of suspicion. A conflict gets described in a way that quietly assigns one person the role of aggressor and another the role of victim before either side has been heard. No dramatic fabrication is required. A detail gets emphasized while another disappears. The order shifts slightly. A motive is suggested without being proven. Then a harder question appears. Was something left out because it seemed unimportant, or because including it would have made you harder to persuade? From the outside, those two situations can look almost identical. That is what makes selective information so effective. By the time the story reaches you, you may already be seeing the situation through somebody else's frame. Once your mind forms a picture, later information no longer arrives in empty space. It has to compete with an interpretation that already feels familiar. Imagine being introduced to a new team with one sentence. He's talented, but he can be difficult. You have done nothing yet, but now confidence may be interpreted as arrogance. Silence can look like resentment. An ordinary disagreement may be treated as proof that the warning was accurate. Here is the strange part. The person who planted that description may never need to mention it again. The group can start maintaining the frame on its own. Ambiguous moments begin to look like evidence, and neutral behavior gets interpreted through the original warning. At that point, the speaker has done very little, yet the original warning may keep shaping how later behavior is judged. That is why effective framing does not always require repeated persuasion. Sometimes one suggestion is enough to influence how later behavior is interpreted. The uncomfortable part is that the entire process may contain nothing you could easily expose as a lie. Selective information can be enough. Protection does not require becoming suspicious of everyone. It requires becoming slower about accepting one version as the complete picture. When an important story reaches you, consider where it came from, what the source stands to gain if you accept it, and whether one missing detail could change the conclusion. There is another question worth keeping in mind. Why am I hearing this version now? Timing can sometimes reveal something about motive, even when the information itself is accurate. That small delay matters. It separates receiving information from surrendering judgment. Information shapes what you believe. The next kind of leverage shapes something more practical. What happens when losing one person starts feeling dangerous? Look closely at any group that has existed for a long time, and you will often find someone who is unusually difficult to remove. They may not have the biggest title or the loudest voice, but when something goes wrong, everyone calls them. They understand the process nobody else understands. They know the person who can solve the problem. They hold the important access, the useful relationship, the experience, or the credibility required when things become complicated. Their influence comes from usefulness. That is very different from constantly demanding respect. When things visibly work better because someone is present, that person does not need to remind everyone of their importance. There is a darker side to the same structure. Value can become dependency, and dependency can become leverage. Picture a small company where one employee controls every important password, most client relationships, critical contacts, and years of institutional knowledge that were never documented anywhere else. At first, that employee looks indispensable. Eventually, the organization becomes trapped. Removing them no longer feels like losing a talented person. It feels like risking the entire system. But usefulness can hide two very different stories. Did that dependency emerge simply because the person was highly competent? Or did the structure become dependent because knowledge was never shared? Access stayed concentrated, and nobody else was encouraged to become capable. Those are very different situations. From the outside, both can look like exceptional usefulness. The same imbalance can develop inside personal relationships. One person handles difficult conversations, makes most decisions, builds social connections, and deals with anything requiring confidence. Over time, the other person stops practicing those abilities. Nobody has to announce a plan. Dependency can grow through repetition. One person keeps stepping in, while the other gradually steps back. Eventually, the person receiving help may start believing they cannot function without the person providing it. Once that belief takes hold, the power of the relationship changes. even if neither side says so openly. That is why being valuable and making somebody helpless are not the same thing. Real value comes from contributing something difficult to replace. Control begins when another person's inability becomes part of your advantage. From the opposite side, look at where one person has become the only route to something important in your life. If they disappeared tomorrow, what would stop functioning? It could be access to work, a professional connection, confidence in a particular situation, or knowledge you never learned because somebody else always handled it. The answer may reveal something you did not realize you had outsourced. The deeper the dependency becomes, the less obvious a threat needs to be. Nobody has to say, "You cannot manage without me." It becomes much more powerful when you have already started believing that on your own. Sometimes leverage is created without information, status, or dependency. It appears because someone does very little. They remain silent. Think about an argument you have probably experienced. Someone says something unfair about you, and the instinct arrives immediately. You want to explain what happened, correct their interpretation, clarify your intention, and remove the discomfort as quickly as possible. Now change one thing. Do not answer immediately. Let the statement sit. Silence can create pressure, especially when someone feels responsible for filling the empty space. When one person refuses to do that, the other may start working harder. They explain what they meant. The explanation grows longer. The original accusation gets softened. Sometimes the real concern appears after the speaker has already talked beyond the position they intended to defend. That is one reason silence can feel exposing. People often prepare for arguments. They are less prepared for empty space. If someone repeatedly goes quiet at exactly the moments when you disagree, the silence may also be functioning as a test of your reaction. How quickly you explain, what you reveal, and whether discomfort is enough to make you reverse a position without anyone directly asking you to. There may be no way to know the person's exact intention from one incident, but if your behavior changes predictably every time they withdraw, the intention matters less than the effect. Predictable reactions create openings. Criticism may trigger over-explaining. Distance can provoke anxiety, and visible disappointment can make you reopen a boundary you had already set. You say you cannot help tonight. The other person becomes quiet. Nothing about the request changes, yet guilt starts pushing you toward explanation. Soon, a simple answer becomes a discussion about whether your reason is good enough. At that point, the important question is whether new information changed your mind, or whether you simply became uncomfortable with how the other person reacted. That distinction matters. Sometimes a pause is only a pause. Other times, the way someone uses silence can reveal whether they were genuinely asking or quietly expecting compliance. You do not need to become cold. You only need enough space between pressure and reaction to notice which situation you are actually in. Silence can protect you from giving too much away. The next tactic can go further. It can make you defend a conclusion that you believe belongs entirely to you. People often respond differently to ideas they believe they discovered themselves. Give someone a direct instruction, and resistance may appear immediately. Influence becomes harder to notice when the conclusion feels self-generated. A person asks a question. That question changes what you focus on. Another question narrows the issue slightly further. One possibility receives attention, while another never enters the discussion. Eventually, you reach a conclusion. Because you completed the final step yourself, the idea feels like yours. And once an idea feels like our own, criticism of it can start feeling like criticism of our judgment. That may make us more willing to defend it. Imagine someone wants your support for a proposal at work. They never ask directly. Over several conversations, they ask what frustrates you about the current system. They repeatedly highlight the problems their proposal happens to solve and encourage you to describe what a better approach might look like. When the proposal finally appears, it resembles the solution you have already been describing. That's exactly what I was thinking. Perhaps it was. But there is a more uncomfortable possibility. You may have genuinely reached the final conclusion yourself, while somebody else shaped the conditions that made that conclusion seem obvious. The distinction is subtle. Not every persuasive question is manipulation. Good teachers, managers, and friends use questions constructively. The difference becomes clearer when you look at the alternatives. Were you allowed to move toward a conclusion the other person might dislike? Or did every branch of the discussion somehow lead back toward the same destination? If only one path survives every question, the conversation may have been more carefully steered than it seemed. Trace the reasoning backward. Look at who introduced the first premise, why that problem became central, and which alternatives disappeared. Then ask whether the same conclusion would still have felt inevitable if the discussion had started somewhere else. Psychological ownership is powerful. That is why the ideas you like most sometimes deserve the closest inspection. Influence is easy to reject when it leads somewhere you dislike. It becomes harder to detect when it leads exactly where you want it to go. And even a good idea becomes difficult to evaluate when somebody else controls how long you have to think about it. Decide now. 2 words can change the quality of a decision before any new evidence appears. The offer supposedly disappears tonight. Someone needs an immediate answer. A disagreement must be resolved before the conversation ends. Sometimes urgency is completely real, but when urgency is manufactured, the psychological mechanism is simple. The decision is no longer only about the decision. Now it is also about escaping the pressure. When somebody suddenly introduces a deadline, ask what materially changed in reality. If nothing changed except their insistence that you act quickly, the urgency itself may be part of the persuasion. Time pressure can narrow how a decision is processed. People may examine fewer alternatives or fall back on simpler strategies, especially when the pressure itself becomes difficult to ignore. Relief can eventually feel more attractive than careful evaluation. Timing also works through delay. A message remains unanswered. A negotiation drags. A decision stays unresolved. You begin checking your phone more often and replaying the conversation, looking for clues. Eventually, you may consider concessions that had nothing to do with the original issue. Perhaps you lower your price or soften a boundary simply to create movement. Nothing new was offered. Uncertainty did the work. That creates another psychological possibility. Sometimes the person who waits longest does not have the strongest position. They may simply understand that the other person hates uncertainty more. If so, patience itself becomes leverage. The useful question is not whether fast is bad or slow is good. It is whether the pace reflects the situation itself or mainly serves somebody's advantage. Timing also reveals how badly you want the outcome. Once another person understands that, they know more about your position than you may realize, which leads to another form of restraint. You do not have to show your entire hand. People are often encouraged to prove competence by showing what they know, laying out the plan, and making their abilities visible. There are situations where that helps, but constant self-revelation can also give somebody else useful information about your position. Revealing your intentions, resources, and alternatives tells the other person how to prepare and how much pressure your position may be able to absorb. Strategic restraint is not pretending to be powerless. It means refusing to reveal information until revealing it serves a clear purpose. This matters especially for people who hate being underestimated. When someone doubts you, there is a powerful urge to correct the record. But consider what happens when you prove too much too early. You may satisfy your pride while giving the other person everything they need to adjust. That creates a strange paradox. The desire to prove your strength can make your position more predictable. Predictability is useful to anyone trying to plan around you. Being underestimated can therefore be uncomfortable and strategically revealing. A person who assumes you have no alternatives may speak more openly. Someone convinced you need their approval may show you exactly how they behave when they believe you cannot leave. That may tell you more than correcting their assumption ever would. Not every misunderstanding requires an immediate answer. Sometimes the more useful information comes from watching what somebody does while they still believe the misunderstanding. There is another way people influence perception. Instead of making you feel underestimated, they make you feel unusually appreciated. A compliment rarely feels like pressure. That is precisely why praise can matter. Someone tells you that you are unusually reliable, that nobody understands them the way you do, or that you are the only person they can truly count on. Then the request arrives. The compliment may be completely sincere. But sincerity does not prevent influence. Compliments can affect how a later request is received, even when the person hearing them is not consciously treating the praise as persuasion. If somebody repeatedly gives you the exact validation you are most hungry for, the unsettling question is whether they merely noticed what was good about you, or also learned which kind of validation makes resistance harder. Those possibilities can coexist. That is why trying to decide whether a compliment is simply fake is not always useful. The pattern tells you more. Does recognition still appear when nothing is needed? Does warmth remain after you refuse? Or does appreciation suddenly become stronger before compliance is needed and disappear after resistance? Praise becomes particularly powerful when it lands on an old insecurity. If someone has spent years feeling overlooked, unimportant, or difficult to love, being told they are rare can carry enormous emotional weight. The request that follows is no longer being evaluated alone. Refusing can start feeling like risking the approval you just received. That is where approval becomes leverage. A useful test is simple. Mentally remove the compliment from the interaction and reconsider the request. If your answer changes, then the praise has entered the negotiation, whether the other person intended it or not. Repeatedly, perfect timing raises a darker possibility. The praise may reflect not only what they value in you, but what they have learned makes you easier to influence. The next tactic changes more than emotion. It changes the boundaries of choice itself. This is the tactic mentioned at the beginning, the one that can leave you feeling completely free, the illusion of choice. Most people resist obvious control. Tell someone they must do something, and the pressure becomes visible. Give them two options, and something psychologically important changes. Would you rather handle this today or tomorrow? Either answer accepts the premise that you will handle it. Do you want option A or option B? The question quietly removes everything outside A and B from attention. Nobody has to take your freedom away. They only need to design the menu. And here is the part that should make you uncomfortable. The better the menu is designed, the less trapped you feel. You compare the options and make the selection yourself, which makes the outcome feel legitimate because you were active in the process. That may be why false autonomy can be so powerful. The feeling of participation can hide the fact that the most important decision happened earlier. Somebody else decided what counted as an option. Imagine a negotiation where you are shown two payment structures. You carefully compare both, but both benefit the person presenting them. The question you never examine is whether either structure needs to be accepted, or someone asks whether you want to discuss a difficult issue now or after dinner. Both options sound respectful, but perhaps you did not want that conversation tonight at all. Once you enter the frame, your attention moves away from the premise and toward choosing the least uncomfortable option inside it. If a person repeatedly gives you choices where every outcome serves them, the real issue may be whether the appearance of choice is hiding an outcome that was largely pre-selected. One interaction cannot prove that. Patterns are what matter. When a choice feels strangely narrow, test whether you can refuse, delay the decision, or introduce another option without being punished or immediately dismissed. If the answer is repeatedly no, the real issue may not be which option you select. It may be who defined the available options. Sometimes control works by narrowing choices. Other times, It works by removing something you had become accustomed to receiving. Constant availability has a strange effect. At first, people appreciate it. You become consistently available, solving problems, checking in first, repairing tension, and quietly keeping things moving. Eventually, the contribution becomes expected. Then you pull back. Suddenly, the absence becomes visible. A team notices how much one person was quietly doing only after mistakes begin appearing. A relationship suddenly feels emptier because the person who always repaired emotional tension stops performing that role. Absence can reveal invisible value, but there is a darker mechanism worth noticing. Some people learn that withdrawal does more than reveal value. It can provoke pursuit. Warmth disappears after resistance. Messages slow down following disagreement. Attention seems to return once the other person becomes more accommodating. From the outside, each incident can look innocent. Inside the person experiencing it, however, a pattern may start forming. Over time, resistance is followed by distance, while cooperation appears to bring the warmth back. If that association becomes strong enough, withdrawal no longer needs to be an explicit punishment. The fear of withdrawal can begin influencing behavior before it happens. That can be psychologically powerful. Once someone starts anticipating distance, they may censor themselves, soften boundaries, or avoid disagreement simply to prevent the emotional loss they expect. At that point, the absence does not even need to happen every time. The possibility may be enough. This does not prove every distant person is manipulating anyone. People become busy. Energy changes. Relationships naturally fluctuate. The relevant question is whether withdrawal consistently appears at moments when one person's control is challenged. If it does, another interpretation becomes harder to ignore. Distance may not only be an absence of affection, it may also be functioning as a consequence. When someone pulls away, resist the immediate urge to chase. Give the pattern enough room to reveal itself. If respect survives without you over-functioning, the connection may be healthier than the anxiety suggested. If the warmth consistently returns only after you give in, that tells a very different story, and all of these tactics become more powerful when one final condition exists. The other person knows you cannot afford to walk away. If somebody knows you need their yes far more than they need yours, the interaction changes. Once they recognize how badly you need the outcome, they can infer that you may tolerate worse conditions or wait longer than they would. That knowledge alone creates leverage. Desperation is dangerous, not because wanting something is shameful. It is dangerous because it reveals the absence of alternatives. Once somebody sees that, they may begin testing where your limits really are. A delay becomes slightly longer. A small concession becomes the new baseline. A condition you would normally reject starts feeling negotiable because the alternative seems unbearable. The pressure may also become more deliberate over time. Sometimes the person applying pressure is not sure how much you will tolerate. They discover it gradually. The pressure can grow through small experiments. A slightly larger request gets accepted, a longer delay produces no resistance, and withdrawal is followed by pursuit. Each reaction can quietly reveal where the next boundary may be tested. Nothing needed to be planned from the beginning. Over time, your reactions can show them where the leverage is. That is why patterns may intensify. Every concession provides information. Every boundary you immediately reverse can teach the other person something about how firm the next boundary really is. The deepest protection is therefore not pretending you do not care. It is having enough alternatives that caring does not trap you. Someone who knows you can leave has to deal with your judgment. Someone who knows you, believe you cannot leave, may only have to manage your fear. That distinction changes everything. Protect your alternatives by building skills, relationships, and routes forward that do not depend on a single gatekeeper. Not because every person will exploit that position, but because when one person possesses nearly all the leverage, Their good intentions become the main thing protecting you from it. Once you see that, the 10 tactics begin collapsing into a smaller set of psychological patterns. Some shape what you perceive by filtering information, framing stories, or selecting the premises from which you begin reasoning. Others work through emotion. Silence can create discomfort. Praise can change the emotional cost of refusal, and urgency or delay can interfere with calm evaluation. Another group reshapes what you believe is possible. Dependency can make alternatives feel unavailable. False choice hides paths outside the menu, and withdrawal may make restoring connection feel more urgent than defending your position. Then there is leverage itself. The final question is what the other person already knows about your needs, your fear of loss, and the reactions you have shown them before. That may be the most uncomfortable part. Influence does not always begin when somebody consciously decides to manipulate you. Sometimes a pattern emerges, somebody notices what works, and the behavior becomes more precise over time. A cold response, an urgent request, or a compliment may begin spontaneously. But when a person repeatedly sees which reaction gets the result they want, the behavior can become more deliberate. You may never know exactly where accident ends and strategy begins. You do not need certainty about someone's private intention to notice what repeated behavior is doing to your decisions. That is the distinction worth protecting. Do not become obsessed with proving motives you cannot see. Look instead for repeated outcomes. Does the same person keep benefiting while pressure rises whenever you resist? Do your options become narrower around them? Do you leave interactions feeling that you acted against your own judgment merely to make the discomfort stop? At the beginning, the question was simple. Why did I agree to that? The deeper question is where the decision actually started. It may have begun much earlier, with a story accepted before hearing the other side, a dependency that slowly made someone feel impossible to replace, or an emotional reaction that turned silence, praise, urgency, or fear of loss into leverage. Sometimes the frame hides alternatives before you even realize alternatives existed. The details change. The underlying pattern stays remarkably similar. Pressure works best before you recognize it as pressure. Once you can see the frame, the silence, the timing, the emotional reward, the withdrawal, or the disappearing alternatives, you regain something important. Not control over the other person. Control over the moment before your reaction becomes your decision. And perhaps that is the most useful question to carry into any interaction that leaves you feeling strangely unsettled. What exactly changed my mind? Was it new information, or did something simply make it more uncomfortable to keep my original position? Those experiences can feel almost identical while they are happening. They are not the same. If one of these 10 patterns made you recognize a situation differently, tell me which one in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns of the psychological patterns people often notice only after they have already influenced the outcome, subscribe. Stay sharp, stay aware, and keep your choices yours. Those experiences can feel almost identical while they are happening. They are not the same. Do you think Machiavelli's real lesson is about controlling others, or recognizing when your own choices are being shaped? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this documentary changed how you see the man behind the punches, like and share it. Subscribe to The Quiet Strategist for our next story about the human cost behind the fight. We will see you in the next story.